Legal Consequences of the Construction of a Wall in Occupied Palestinian Territory by Ryan Tabazian. This is a legal case which took place in 2004 between Palestinian authorities and Israel, which was eventually brought to the attention of the United Nations. In this case, we will have the United Nations as the plaintiffs and Israel as the defendants. The key parties involved. This case involved many parties. However, for this debate, we'll primarily focus on the following four parties. The defendants in this case, Israel, were responsible for constructing a wall, citing security concerns and the need to prevent future terrorist attacks. The second party in this case is the Palestinian Authority, who argue that this wall was an illegal annexation and violated Palestinian rights. The issue would come to the attention of the third major party, the United Nations General Assembly, who requested an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, the final party. Ultimately, it would be the responsibility of the ICJ to deliver an advisory opinion on the legality of the wall. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict dates back to the mid-20th century, with ongoing tension over land, sovereignty, and security. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel gained control of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. While this was seen as a military victory for Israel, it also intensified disputes over territorial claim. In response to international concerns, the Oslo Accords aimed to create a pathway for peace by granting the Palestinian Authority limited self-rule. However, these agreements did not resolve the core issues such as borders, settlements, and the status of Jerusalem. Following the outbreak of the Second Intifada, Palestinian militant groups carried out numerous attacks, including suicide bombings that killed hundreds of Israeli citizens. In response, Israel began constructing a security barrier in 2002. The purpose of this wall was simple: to prevent future attacks and protect Israeli citizens. While Israel justified the wall as a security measure, Palestinians and the UN argued that its route was a real issue. Instead of following Israel's internationally recognized borders, the wall extends deep into Palestinian lands, violating the 1967 Green Line. This has led to land confiscation, restricted movements, and increased hardship for Palestinian communities. So now we're going to go over Israel's position. Israel's construction of the security barrier was seen as a necessary response to a wave of deadly attacks during the Second Intifada. The decision was driven by security concerns, not political motives. Let's examine Israel's justification. The main justification they had was self-defense, citing UN Charter Article 51, which states that every state has the right to protect its citizens. Under this, Israel has the right to self-defense. Suicide bombings and attacks on Israeli citizens had become a daily reality. The wall was not built to annex the lands, but to prevent these attacks and save lives. Secondly, Israel has consistently stated that the wall is not a permanent border, but a temporary security concern. Its purpose is solely defensive, designed to deter terrorism, not determine future territorial boundaries. Israel remains open to negotiations on the final status of Palestinian land. Another big justification which coincides with Israel's right to self-defense was to prevent future attacks. The effectiveness of the wall cannot be ignored. Since its construction, terrorist attacks inside Israel have significantly decreased, proving that the barrier serves its intended purpose. Without it, Israeli citizens remain vulnerable to further violence. Lastly, Israel challenges the ICJ's jurisdiction over this matter. The issue of the wall is deeply political and should not be resolved through direct negotiations between Israel and Palestine, not an external legal ruling. The ICJ's decision was advisory, and Israel maintains that security concern must take precedence over international opinion. There are a few relevant cases which support Israel's case for the construction of a wall, which the ICJ would attempt to dispute. The first would be the Caroline case of 1837. The Caroline incident refers to a British attack on American steamboat, the Caroline, that was allegedly aiding Canadian rebels. The U.S. protested, leading to a diplomatic exchange that established a principle that preemptive self-defense is not only justified if the threat is imminent, overwhelming, and leaves no choice of means or moment for deliberation. Israel argued that this wall was a preemptive security measure to prevent future terrorist attacks. The second case that Israel argued was under the ICJ ruling of the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. The ICJ was asked whether or not the use of the use or threat of nuclear weapons was legal under international law. The court ruled that self-defense would justify extreme measures, but did not conclusively decide whether or not nuclear weapons could be used lawfully in all cases. The ruling emphasized that self-defense must comply with international humanitarian law. Israel invoked self-defense to justify the construction of the wall, similar to arguments made in favor of nuclear deterrence. Now we're going to examine Palestine and the UN's position. The construction of Israel's wall in occupied Palestinian territory is not a security measure. It is a violation of international law, Palestinian sovereignty, and fundamental human rights. Let's examine why the wall is illegal and just. Firstly, the UN and Palestinian Authority claim the wall does not follow Israel's recognized borders. Instead, it cuts deep into Palestinian lands beyond the 1949 Armistice Line, also known as the Green Line. By seizing Palestinian territory and incorporating Israeli settlements within its route, the wall effectively annexes land, violating international law. Secondly, the wall has had devastating effects on Palestinian communities. It restricts freedom of movement, separates family, and limits access to healthcare, education, and employment. Many Palestinians have been cut off from their own farmland and businesses, forcing them into poverty. This violates basic human rights under international law. Israel's actions defy many international legal agreements, such as the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49, which prohibits occupying power from transferring its own population into occupied territory, and the UN Charter, Article 2, Line 4, which forbids the acquisition of land by force. By constructing a wall, Israel is violating these fundamental legal principles. Lastly, the wall is not just a physical barrier, it is a political statement that undermines Palestinian sovereignty. By fragmenting Palestinian lands, the wall makes the creation of a viable Palestinian state nearly impossible. This directly violates Palestinian people's rights to self-determination, a fundamental principle in international law. The UN's cases against the construction of the wall were as follows. Firstly, the United Nations Charter, Article 2, Section 4. Explicitly prohibits the acquisition of land through force. Israel's wall extends beyond its recognized borders, effectively annexing Palestinian land. This is a violation of one of the most fundamental principles of international law, that no state may take a territory by military force. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49, an occupying power cannot transfer its own population into occupied territory. Yet Israel has constructed a wall in a way that incorporates illegal Israeli settlements within the Western Bank. This is a direct violation of international humanitarian law. Lastly, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ICESCR, protects the freedom of movement and basic human civilians. This wall cuts off Palestinian communities from schools, hospitals, and workplaces, severely restricting their rights to make daily life unbearable. The results and implications. After much deliberation, the ICJ found that Israel's case for the wall was invalid, stating that under the Caroline standard, defense requires an imminent threat. The ICJ ruled that Israel's generalized security concerns did not justify the wall's route through Palestinian territory. The ICJ concluded that self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter applies to attacks by states, not non-state actors. On the other concern, the ICJ applied the same legal tests and found that the wall violated international law by disproportionately harming Palestinian civilians and altering territorial boundaries. Israel's claim of self-defense was deemed insufficient to justify violating humanitarian law. The ICJ finalized the ruling by stating that the wall was legal under international law. The ICJ ordered that the wall be dismantled and any built sections of the wall be torn down. Israel would be forced to compensate the Palestinians whose rights were affected. And lastly, the ICJ would call upon all states to not recognize or support the erection of the wall. And the ICJ would call upon the UN to take action to make sure that Israel would comply. This case created lasting implications for the international community because while many countries and international organizations support the ICJ's decision, Israel rejected it, arguing that security concerns outweighed legal ruling. This has widened division between Israel and the UN, as well as many countries that support Israel and those that back Palestine's sovereignty. The rulings reinforced key principles of international law, particularly regarding territorial sovereignty, occupation, and human rights. It affirmed that a state cannot unilaterally annex land under the guise of security. The decision is now cited in legal debates about occupation and self-determination in other conflicts. Despite the ICJ's ruling, Israel continued the construction of a wall. The ICJ does not have the enforcement powers, and no concrete action was taken by the UN Security Council to compel compliance. This highlights a major weakness in international law. Even when violations are recognized, enforcement often depends on political will. Lastly, to this day, the wall remains a symbol of division. Israel argues that it is used to prevent terrorist attacks, while Palestinians see it as a land grab that restricts their daily lives. The conflict over the wall is far from resolved, and it continues to fuel tensions today between Israel and Palestine. In conclusion, this case illustrates the tensions between security concerns and international legal obligations. Israel prioritized protection from terrorism, while the international community viewed the wall as an unlawful annexation and violation of Palestinian rights. The debate remains unsolved, shaping regional and global discussions on sovereignty, occupation, and human rights.